The story begins in the rugged land of Macedonia, a kingdom on the northern edges of the Greek world, where the mountains cradle fertile valleys and the people live hardened lives on the frontier of civilization. It was here, in the summer of 356 BCE, that a child was born who would one day shake the very foundations of the known world. His name was Alexander, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. From the beginning, legends seemed to swirl around his birth. Ancient writers would later claim that on the very night Alexander came into the world, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus was consumed by fire, as though the gods themselves were announcing the arrival of a figure destined to alter the course of history. Philip II, Alexander's father, was no ordinary man. A master tactician and a visionary, Philip had transformed Macedonia from a fractured backwater into a rising power. His reforms of the army introduced the formidable Macedonian phalanx with its sarissas, enormous spears that bristled like a wall of iron and advanced with crushing force. Under Philip's rule, the Macedonians subdued neighboring tribes and secured dominance over Greece, making Philip both admired and feared. Yet the boy who watched his father's triumphs from the palace in Pella would grow restless, dreaming of far greater horizons. Alexander's childhood was not one of soft luxury, but of rigorous training and relentless exposure to the lessons of war and philosophy. His mother, Olympias, a woman of fierce spirit and fervent devotion to the gods, filled his mind with stories of divine lineage. She whispered that he was descended from Achilles, the greatest hero of the Trojan War, and from Heracles, the son of Zeus. These tales took root in the young prince's imagination, shaping a belief that he was destined for greatness beyond mortal limits. Yet Olympias was also a deeply political figure, embroiled in intrigues and rivalries within the Macedonian court. From her, Alexander learned not only piety, but also cunning, ambition, and a sharp understanding of power. When Alexander was old enough to study, Philip sought the finest tutor he could find. That man was Aristotle, the philosopher whose writings would echo through centuries. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander's mind was sharpened with lessons in philosophy, science, ethics, and literature. He read Homer's epics with passion, memorizing verses of the Iliad, which became his constant companion in battle. Aristotle instilled in him a curiosity about the natural world, a respect for knowledge, and a vision of ruling not merely through conquest, but through culture and administration. Yet Alexander was never content with theory alone. He demanded action. Even as a youth, he showed flashes of daring that startled those around him. One story tells of a powerful and untamable horse brought before Philip. None of his men could mount it, for it reared and bucked violently at every attempt. As the crowd jeered and the animal resisted, the young Alexander stepped forward. He had noticed the horse's terror of its own shadow. Gently, patiently, he turned the animal toward the sun, calming it, and with astonishing confidence he mounted and rode it across the field. The horse, Bucephalus, would become his loyal companion for years, carrying him through countless battles. Philip is said to have wept with pride, declaring that Macedonia was too small for his son's ambitions, and that he must seek a kingdom worthy of him. Alexander's youth was also marked by his participation in real campaigns. At just 16, when Philip was away at war, Alexander was left to govern Macedonia. He crushed a rebellion with ruthless efficiency, founding a city in his own name to mark the victory. By 18, he fought alongside his father at the Battle of Chaeronea, where the Macedonian army faced a coalition of Greek city-states. Alexander commanded the cavalry with decisive brilliance, shattering the enemy lines and securing victory. Already, his reputation as a warrior and leader was spreading. Yet, as Philip's ambitions expanded, so too did tensions within the royal family. Philip sought new alliances through marriage, taking a Macedonian noblewoman as a bride, which cast doubt on Alexander's legitimacy as heir. Furious quarrels erupted between father and son, fueled by Olympia's jealous anger. For a time, Alexander left the court, uncertain of his future, but fate would intervene with sudden violence. In 336 BCE, at a grand festival in Aegae, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. Amid the chaos, suspicion spread in all directions. Some whispered that Olympias herself had played a role. Whatever the truth, the crown now passed to the 20-year-old Alexander. His accession was far from secure. Rivals lurked within the Macedonian nobility, and subject states across Greece saw an opportunity to cast off Macedonian dominance. Alexander acted with speed and ferocity. He eliminated potential claimants to the throne, securing his power at home. Then he marched south, confronting Thebes and Athens, cities restless under Macedonian rule. When Thebes dared to rise in open rebellion, Alexander responded with devastating force. The city was besieged, stormed, and utterly destroyed, its walls torn down, its people sold into slavery, its memory preserved only as a warning to others. The message was clear. Alexander was not his father's shadow, but a king who would brook no defiance. Having secured Greece, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. Philip had long planned an invasion of the Persian Empire, the vast dominion that stretched from Asia Minor to the Indus River, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia. Now Alexander would inherit that dream. Persia, though mighty in size, was weakened by internal strife and decadence. Its ruler, Darius III, commanded enormous armies, yet the spirit of the empire was fraying. For Alexander, this was more than a campaign of conquest. It was a chance to carve his name alongside the heroes of old, to march into Asia as a new Achilles. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with an army of some 35,000 men. They were a mix of Macedonians and Greeks, hardened by years of training, disciplined beyond compare. As his feet touched the soil of Asia, Alexander performed a ritual offering at the tomb of Achilles, girding himself for the struggle to come. Ahead lay a series of battles that would test his courage, his intellect, and his ambition to their very limits. The first clash came swiftly, at the river Granicus in Asia Minor. The Persians had assembled a force to block his advance, lining the opposite bank with cavalry and mercenaries. The river ran fast and deep, and to charge across it seemed madness. Yet Alexander led the assault personally, plunging into the torrent, his men struggling to keep their footing as arrows and javelins rained down. For a moment, chaos threatened to overwhelm them. Then Alexander himself, shining in his distinctive armor, with a plume rising from his helmet, drove into the Persian ranks. His spear struck down enemy nobles, and his presence ignited his troops with renewed fury. The Persians faltered, broke, and were scattered. The victory at Granicus opened the gates of Asia Minor and marked the beginning of a campaign that would astonish the world. As Alexander advanced, city after city either submitted or fell before him. Sardis, the great capital of Lydia, surrendered without resistance. In towns that resisted, he installed Macedonian garrisons, but in those that yielded, he showed clemency, presenting himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He declared himself the avenger of Greece against Persian oppression, framing his campaign as one of justice rather than aggression. Yet beneath the rhetoric, his ambition burned with intensity. Each step carried him deeper into Asia, further from Macedonia, and closer to the destiny his mother had foretold. The campaign was only beginning. Ahead lay greater challenges, for the Persian Empire was vast, and its king would not sit idly by as a foreign invader marched unchecked. Soon Alexander would face the might of Darius himself, in battles that would decide the fate of empires. The summer sun burned over the plains of Asia as Alexander pressed forward, his army marching with relentless purpose. News of the young Macedonian king's advance spread quickly. Unsettling satraps and governors who had long administered the provinces of the Persian Empire. Some surrendered without resistance, preferring to spare their cities from destruction. Others fortified themselves, trusting in Persian might to drive the invader back. But Alexander's momentum was unstoppable, each victory swelling his reputation, each submission expanding his dominion. As the campaign pressed deeper, Darius III could no longer ignore the threat. He assembled a vast army, drawing from every corner of his empire. The Persians, masters of wealth and resources, could summon legions of cavalry, archers, and mercenaries, dwarfing Alexander's comparatively small force. Confident in sheer numbers, Darius moved to confront the Macedonians. The two forces finally clashed in 333 BCE near the town of Issus, in a narrow coastal plain hemmed in by mountains and sea. The setting favored Alexander. The terrain compressed Darius's enormous army, preventing him from deploying his numerical advantage. As the two armies arrayed themselves, Alexander rode before his men, reminding them of their training, their discipline, and their cause. He reminded them that they fought not just for themselves, but for Greece, for vengeance and for the glory of their king. Across the field, Darius placed himself at the center of his forces, surrounded by his elite guard. His banners fluttered, golden and rich with emblems of the empire. He looked every inch the ruler of the world, yet within him was a growing sense of unease. The battle began with a thunderous clash of projectiles. Persian archers unleashed volleys of arrows, while Greek mercenaries on the Persian side surged forward. Alexander, commanding the right flank, led his companion cavalry in a fierce charge. The ground shook as hooves thundered, the Macedonian lances piercing through the enemy ranks. On the left, his general Parmenion held firm against overwhelming pressure, his men fighting desperately to hold the line. At the critical moment, Alexander saw his opening. With characteristic boldness, he drove directly at the Persian center, aiming not at the army, but at Darius himself. The young king's armor glinted in the sun as he carved a path through the chaos, cutting down nobles who rushed to protect their ruler. Suddenly, panic rippled through the Persian ranks. Darius, seeing Alexander bearing down upon him, lost his nerve. Abandoning his chariot, he fled the field, leaving behind his mother, wife, and children to fall into Alexander's hands. The rout was complete. Tens of thousands of Persians were slain or captured, while Alexander's victory cemented his image as invincible. Yet the aftermath revealed another side to his character. Rather than humiliate the captured family of Darius, Alexander treated them with honor, refusing to exploit their vulnerability. He even reassured Darius's mother that her son still lived, showing a respect that astonished both friend and foe. This act of clemency was not mere kindness, it was strategy, for Alexander sought to present himself not only as conqueror, but as rightful successor to the Persian throne. From Issus, the Macedonian king turned south, toward the great cities of the Levant and Egypt. But along the way, he encountered one of the most stubborn defenses of his entire campaign, the island city of Tyre. Situated half a mile offshore, Tyre was encircled by massive walls and protected by a powerful fleet. The Tyrians, confident in their defenses, defied Alexander, refusing him entry to their sacred temples. For months, Alexander besieged the city, constructing an enormous causeway across the sea, battering the walls with siege engines and repelling counterattacks launched from the water. The struggle tested both his patience and his ingenuity, but at last the walls fell. The Macedonians stormed the city, unleashing brutal vengeance for its resistance. Thousands were killed, and survivors sold into slavery. The destruction of Tyre was a warning to all. No fortress, no matter how strong, could withstand Alexander's determination. With the Levant subdued, Egypt beckoned. There Alexander was welcomed as a liberator. For centuries, Egypt had groaned under Persian rule, and the arrival of the Macedonian king was greeted with celebration. In Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, embraced by priests who hailed him as the son of Amun, their chief deity. It was in Egypt that Alexander founded one of his greatest legacies, the city of Alexandria, envisioned as a hub of trade, learning, and culture, connecting Greece and the East. The foundations laid there would grow into one of the most influential cities of antiquity, a beacon of Hellenistic civilization. But Alexander's journey in Egypt held a deeper, almost mystical chapter. He traveled into the vast western desert, to the Oracle of Siwa, a remote sanctuary dedicated to the god Amun. Few dared to cross the barren sands, yet Alexander pressed forward, driven by a desire to seek confirmation of his divine destiny. When he emerged from the shrine, he revealed little of what the oracle had spoken, but whispers spread that he had been addressed as the son of Zeus Ammon, the living embodiment of a god. Whether this was truth or invention mattered little. The belief in his divine nature would only grow stronger, both in his own mind and in the imagination of those who followed him. From Egypt, Alexander turned once more to confront Darius. The Persian king, humiliated by his flight at Issus, had rallied again, gathering a colossal army said to number in the hundreds of thousands. He positioned his forces near the village of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, on a vast plain carefully chosen to maximize the advantage of his cavalry and war chariots. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of empires. As dawn broke over the battlefield, Alexander surveyed the Persian host stretched across the horizon. His men were outnumbered many times over, yet their discipline, training, and confidence in their commander gave them an edge no numbers could match. The Persians unleashed their chariots, scythed with blades designed to tear through enemy ranks. But Alexander's men skillfully opened their lines, allowing the deadly machines to pass harmlessly through before cutting them down. Then, with perfect timing, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation, driving directly at the heart of the Persian line. Dust billowed, steel clashed, and once again the Macedonian king aimed at Darius himself. The Persian monarch, confronted with the terrifying spectacle of Alexander charging toward him, lost his resolve. For the second time he turned and fled, his vast army dissolving into chaos. The field was littered with the dead, the Persian Empire shattered. Gaugamela was not merely a victory, it was a conquest of the world. In its aftermath, Babylon opened its gates to Alexander. The treasures of Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, fell into his hands. In triumph, he marched into the palaces of the great kings, seated himself upon their thrones, and declared himself ruler of Asia. To mark his victory, he set fire to the grand palace of Persepolis, a gesture some saw as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens during the Greco-Persian Wars, while others saw it as an act of reckless destruction. Whatever the motive, the flames consumed centuries of grandeur, symbolizing the end of Persia's dominance and the rise of a new order. Yet Alexander was not content to stop. His hunger for conquest, for glory, for destiny, drove him ever forward. Even as he claimed the crown of Persia, he looked eastward to lands beyond the horizon, to realms whispered of in legends but unseen by Greeks or Macedonians. Ahead lay the unknown, and Alexander was determined to march into it, reshaping the world with every step. The victory at Gaugamela might have satisfied any ordinary conqueror. Persia's kingship was his, its capital surrendered, its treasures plundered. To sit upon the throne of Darius, to wear the robes of the great king, was already to hold more power than any Macedonian or Greek had ever imagined. Yet Alexander was no ordinary conqueror. For him, victory was never an end, but a gateway to the next horizon. His ambition was insatiable, and his vision stretched beyond Persia's borders, beyond the limits of maps known to his people. He would not rest until he had reached the edges of the world itself. After Gaugamela, Alexander marched to Babylon, where the city welcomed him as a liberator. Rich and ancient, with gardens, ziggurats, and walls that had once been counted among the wonders of the earth, Babylon was the jewel of Mesopotamia. Alexander wisely preserved its traditions, honoring local gods and respecting the priesthoods, presenting himself not as a destroyer, but as a rightful heir. From there he moved to Susa, where the treasury of Persia overflowed with unimaginable wealth. Gold and silver piled in hoards beyond reckoning, enough to fund his campaigns for decades. But Alexander's eyes turned still farther east, toward Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire. When his army entered Persepolis, they marveled at its palaces, columns, and stairways, carved with scenes of tribute from every nation under Persian rule. Here in this seat of grandeur, Alexander lingered, allowing his men to taste the luxury of victory. But amidst the revelry, a decision was made that would echo through history. One night, after a feast of wine and celebration, Alexander ordered the palace of Xerxes to be set ablaze. Flames consumed the wood and stone, leaping into the night sky while Macedonians danced around the inferno. Some claimed it was revenge for the Persians' burning of Athens long ago. Others believed it was drunken impulse, later regretted. Whatever the reason, the destruction marked a turning point. The palace that had symbolized Persian majesty was reduced to ashes, and with it, a chapter of ancient civilization ended. From Persepolis, Alexander pursued Darius himself, who still fled eastward, desperate to raise new forces. The chase led through the highlands and deserts of Persia, across treacherous terrain where his men suffered from heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Yet Alexander's resolve never wavered. His pursuit ended in tragedy, for Darius was betrayed by his own satrap, Bessus, who seized him and left him mortally wounded. When Alexander arrived, he found the great king dying by the roadside. With his last breath, Darius is said to have asked Alexander to avenge him, entrusting his empire to the Macedonian. Alexander wept at the sight, draping his cloak over the fallen monarch and declaring himself the rightful successor of the Achaemenid dynasty. But succession was never so simple. To the Persians, Alexander was still a foreign conqueror, an outsider who wore the crown of their kings. To cement his rule, he adopted Persian customs, donning royal robes, employing eunuchs and courtiers, and demanding proskynesis, the act of bowing before the king. For his Macedonian companions, this was an outrage. They saw their commander turning into a Persian despot, abandoning the rough simplicity of a soldier for the trappings of tyranny. Murmurs of dissent grew louder, resentment simmered, and loyalty was tested as Alexander began to transform from Macedonian king to cosmopolitan ruler. His determination to fuse East and West went beyond ceremony. He married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, not merely out of passion, but as a political gesture. Binding himself to the Persian aristocracy, he encouraged his officers to take Persian wives as well, seeking to create a new elite that blended Macedonian and Persian blood. He founded cities everywhere he went, more than 70 in total, each bearing his name or dedicated to his vision. These cities were not just garrisons, but centers of culture, trade, and administration, spreading Greek language and customs across Asia while absorbing local traditions in return. Through them, Alexander laid the foundations of what would become the Hellenistic world, a fusion of East and West that outlived him by centuries. But empire was never secure without conquest, and Alexander was not content with the heartlands of Persia alone. Beyond the mountains lay Bactria and Sogdiana, lands of fierce tribes and endless resistance. His campaigns there tested his endurance and his men's patience. The people of these regions did not yield easily. They fought with guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and raids, vanishing into rugged terrain that no phalanx could tame. For years, Alexander waged war in the east, building fortresses, crushing revolts, and hunting down elusive enemies. It was in these harsh campaigns that his cruelty began to show. Cities that resisted were razed, populations slaughtered, rebellions met with unflinching brutality. The hero who had once shown clemency at Issus now became a harsher figure, consumed by his drive to dominate. In the midst of these struggles, cracks widened among his companions. Parmenion, his loyal general, and Parmenion's son Philotas fell under suspicion of treason. Philotas was accused of plotting against Alexander, and under torture confessed to charges that may or may not have been true. He was executed, and Parmenion, though far away commanding an army, was also put to death on Alexander's orders. The executions shocked many, for Parmenion had been a steadfast ally since the days of Philip. But Alexander would tolerate no rival, no shadow of disloyalty. Trust was replaced by fear, and the circle around him grew ever tighter. Even closer friends were not spared. Clitus the Black, the officer who had once saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, fell victim to his wrath. At a banquet, as wine flowed and tempers flared, Clitus dared to criticize the king, reminding him of the valor of Macedonians and denouncing his adoption of Persian customs. In a drunken rage, Alexander seized a spear and struck Clitus dead. The moment was followed by remorse, but the deed could not be undone. The man who had once been surrounded by comrades now found himself increasingly isolated, a godlike figure towering above men, yet estranged from those who had marched with him since the beginning. And still, Alexander's eyes turned farther east. Tales of India, of kingdoms rich with elephants and wonders, reached him, igniting his ambition anew. Beyond the Hindu Kush lay lands few Greeks had ever seen, where rivers wider than any in Europe flowed, and rulers commanded armies unlike anything encountered before. To march there was to step beyond the edge of the known world, yet Alexander would not be deterred. His dream was to unite not just Greece and Persia, but all lands under one dominion, stretching to the ends of the earth. Crossing into India, Alexander's army faced rivers swollen with monsoon rains and climates alien to Macedonian soldiers. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, they encountered King Porus, who brought forth elephants to the battlefield, their massive forms armored and towering, striking fear into men and horses alike. The clash was ferocious, with Alexander forced to adapt his tactics against an enemy unlike any he had faced before. Through maneuver and determination, he triumphed, but the victory came at great cost. Impressed by Porus's bravery, Alexander restored him as ruler, now an ally under Macedonian overlordship. But the further Alexander pressed, the more his men began to resist. Exhaustion, homesickness, and the endless march through alien lands wore them down. At the Hyphasis River, when Alexander demanded to push farther east, his soldiers finally refused. They had marched for years, crossed deserts and mountains, fought countless battles, and now they longed only for home. Alexander raged, pleading, threatening, but their resolve was unshakable. At last he relented, turning back from the edge of the world he so desperately sought. The return would prove no less brutal than the advance. Alexander led his men through the Gedrosian desert, where scorching heat and lack of water decimated his army. Thousands perished, their bones whitening in the sand. Yet Alexander shared their suffering, marching on foot, refusing water unless all could drink, enduring the hardships alongside his men. By the time they emerged, his army was battered but unbroken, and his legend had grown still greater. When he returned to Babylon, Alexander was master of an empire that stretched farther than any before him. But though his conquests were complete, his heart was restless. Plans brewed in his mind, new campaigns into Arabia, perhaps beyond. His ambition remained boundless, as if the earth itself could never contain his desire. Yet fate was closing in, and the man who had marched from Macedonia to the ends of the world would soon face the one enemy no conqueror could defeat. The long road of conquest had left Alexander both triumphant and weary, standing at the pinnacle of power, yet weighed down by the endless burden of command. When he returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, the city became the center of his vast dominion. Here, where the Euphrates flowed broad and slow past ancient temples and towering walls, Alexander planned the next stage of his vision. For though his soldiers had forced him to turn back from India, his ambition had not cooled. Arabia beckoned with its riches, and beyond it lay lands barely whispered of, realms he dreamed of adding to his empire. Babylon, however, was more than a military base. It was the hub of an empire stretching from Greece to Egypt, from the Mediterranean to the mountains of Central Asia. Governing such a realm demanded more than force of arms. Alexander now turned to administration, forging unity from diversity. He confirmed Persian satraps in their positions, while placing Macedonian overseers beside them, creating a delicate balance of authority. He encouraged marriages between his officers and Persian noblewomen, binding two elites together in blood and kinship. At Susa, he staged a grand mass wedding, where scores of his companions wed Persian brides, while he himself took not only Roxana, but also daughters of Darius and Artaxerxes into his household. It was an extraordinary vision. One people, one empire, blending the traditions of Greece and the East. Yet the vision was not shared by all. Many Macedonians grumbled at these customs, resenting the adoption of Persian dress, ceremony, and gods. They longed for the simplicity of their old king, who fought beside them in the dust and drank with them in the evening, not the godlike ruler enthroned in Babylon. When Alexander attempted to integrate Persian soldiers into his ranks, tension boiled over. His veterans demanded to be sent home, feeling replaced by foreigners. For days Alexander raged, dismissing them with bitter contempt. Yet at last, in a moment of reconciliation, he invited them back, weeping before them, reminding them of the hardships they had shared. The rift healed, but it revealed the fragile balance of loyalty within his empire. Even among his closest companions, mistrust grew. The death of Hephaestion, Alexander's dearest friend and possibly the one soul who truly understood him, struck like a thunderbolt. Hephaestion had been more than a general. He was Alexander's alter ego, his confidant since youth. When he fell ill and died suddenly, Alexander's grief was uncontrollable. He cast himself upon the body, refused food, and ordered extravagant honors. He commanded that temples be built in Hephaestion's name, that sacred fire be extinguished across the empire, mourning imposed as if for a king. For months he wandered in sorrow, consumed by loss. Some whispered that in Hephaestion's death, Alexander's own spirit was broken. Yet even in grief, he did not abandon his dreams. Plans unfurled for a new campaign into Arabia, fleets were constructed, scouts sent to chart coastlines and deserts. He envisioned conquering the Arabian Peninsula, then perhaps moving westward to Carthage or beyond. His mind seemed incapable of rest, always grasping at new horizons, but as preparations gathered, fate intervened. In June of 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill after a banquet. Accounts differ. Some say fever, others poison, though most likely it was disease, perhaps malaria or typhoid. For days he burned with fever, unable to rise from his bed. His generals and soldiers crowded outside his chambers, desperate for news. Unable to speak, Alexander at last was carried to the river, where his men filed past him, gazing upon their stricken king in silence. With a faint gesture, he acknowledged them, his once mighty voice reduced to whispers. When asked to whom he left his empire, he is said to have answered simply, "To the strongest." On the 10th or 11th day of his illness, Alexander the Great was dead. He was 32 years old. The news spread like fire across Babylon. Soldiers wept openly, others raged, unable to comprehend that the man who had seemed invincible could be struck down so suddenly. His empire, vast and fragile, was left without a clear heir. Roxana was pregnant, but the child was not yet born. Alexander's generals, men who had marched with him across continents, now turned upon each other in a struggle for supremacy. The empire of Alexander did not outlive him intact. Within months, it splintered into rival realms, his successors, known as the Diadochi, fighting bitter wars for control. His body became the first prize of contention. Originally destined for burial in Macedonia, it was seized and diverted to Egypt by Ptolemy, one of his generals, who founded his own dynasty there. In Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded, his tomb became a site of pilgrimage, visited by emperors and conquerors for centuries. Even in death, his presence cast a shadow that could not be ignored. Though his empire fractured, Alexander's influence endured. His campaigns had spread Greek language, art, and ideas across Asia, mingling with local cultures to create a new world, the Hellenistic Age. In cities he founded, libraries rose, marketplaces flourished, and scholars gathered, blending knowledge from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and India. Trade routes connected lands that had once been strangers, carrying silk, spices, and philosophies across continents. The world was larger, richer, and more interconnected than ever before, because Alexander had marched through it. Yet his legacy was not only cultural, but also mythic. To the Greeks, he was a hero greater than Achilles. To the Persians, he was remembered with both awe and bitterness. In the East, legends arose of Iskander, a mighty ruler whose exploits filled poetry and story. Across centuries and civilizations, his image shifted, warrior, liberator, tyrant, god, but never faded. He became a mirror onto which each age projected its ideals of power and destiny. Still, questions remain. Was he a visionary who sought to unite mankind under one rule, or merely a conqueror driven by insatiable ambition? Was his dream of fusion between East and West sincere, or a mask for domination? His ruthlessness was real, his destruction undeniable. Thebes lay in ruins, Tyre had been burned, Persepolis consumed by fire. Yet so too were his moments of clemency, his respect for conquered peoples, his attempt to create something new from the wreckage of war. His life was a paradox, a whirlwind of creation and destruction that reshaped the ancient world. In the end, Alexander's greatness cannot be measured only in the lands he conquered. It lies in the audacity of his vision, in the way he expanded the boundaries of what was thought possible. He took a small kingdom on the edge of Greece and transformed it into the largest empire the world had ever seen. He carried his men through deserts and mountains to the edge of the known world, demanding of them the impossible, and more often than not, achieving it. He was cruel and brilliant, reckless and wise, mortal and yet almost divine in the scale of his ambition. When he died in Babylon, the earth itself seemed to shudder, as though some cosmic balance had been disturbed. His empire broke apart, but his legend endured, carried in the stories of soldiers, poets, and chroniclers. Centuries later, Julius Caesar would weep at the statue of Alexander, lamenting that at the same age he had achieved so little in comparison. Napoleon would model himself upon him, and countless rulers would invoke his name. Alexander's shadow fell across all who sought power, all who dreamed of empire. And so his story passed into history, not as the tale of a man alone, but as the story of an age transformed by his will. The world he left behind was never the same. Its borders stretched, its cultures mingled, its imagination forever expanded. In life, he had conquered nations. In death, he conquered memory itself, becoming immortal in the annals of human history. The story of Alexander does not end with his death in Babylon, for in many ways, that moment was only the beginning of his second life, the life of legend, memory, and influence that spanned centuries. The man was gone, his body cold and carried away to rest in Alexandria. But the idea of Alexander endured, reshaped again and again by those who came after him, molded into a figure greater than flesh, greater than history, greater even than empire itself. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the empire he had carved across continents shattered under the weight of its own vastness. His generals, men who had once marched shoulder to shoulder with him, now turned upon each other in wars of succession. Ptolemy claimed Egypt, Seleucus gained Persia and much of the East, Antigonus sought dominance over Asia Minor, and Cassander entrenched himself in Macedonia. What had been united under a single will now fractured into kingdoms, each ruled by men who styled themselves heirs of Alexander. These wars of the Diadochi were brutal, relentless, and unending, but even as they tore the empire apart, they ensured that Alexander's world, the world he had opened, did not collapse back into isolation. The cities he had founded, over 70, scattered from Egypt to the frontiers of India, became the anchor points of a new age. In Alexandria, the city that bore his name, a library arose that gathered the knowledge of the known world. A lighthouse stood among the wonders of antiquity, and trade connected the Nile to the Mediterranean and beyond. In Bactria and Sogdiana, Greek settlers intermarried with locals, creating kingdoms where Greek temples stood beside Eastern shrines. In the courts of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, Greek became the language of government and philosophy, while Persian and Egyptian traditions intertwined with Hellenic culture. This fusion was the hallmark of what we now call the Hellenistic world. It was not simply Greek culture imposed upon others, nor the old civilizations swallowed whole, but a blending that gave rise to something entirely new. Greek sculpture found inspiration in Eastern motifs, philosophies spread across borders, and science flourished in centers of learning Alexander had made possible. Medicine, astronomy, and mathematics advanced, influenced by the mingling of traditions from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. The very shape of thought in the ancient world was altered, and behind it all lay the imprint of Alexander's march. But beyond culture, Alexander's memory became a symbol, a mirror into which later rulers gazed, hoping to glimpse their own greatness. To the Romans, he was a model of ambition. Julius Caesar, standing before a statue of Alexander in Spain, is said to have wept, lamenting that at the same age he had accomplished so little. Pompey took the title the Great in conscious imitation, while Augustus arranged for his own body to be displayed alongside Alexander's in Alexandria, seeking to link his image to the conquerors. To them, Alexander was both warning and inspiration, a man who had achieved more than any other, but whose empire had slipped from his grasp in death. In the East, he was remembered in a different guise. To Persians and later Islamic writers, he became Iskander, the two-horned one, a figure both admired and feared. Stories spread of his journeys beyond the known world, of encounters with strange creatures, of walls he built to confine barbaric tribes. In these tales, Alexander became not merely a conqueror, but a mythic hero, a wanderer whose adventures transcended history. To Egyptians, he was a pharaoh, son of Amun, a rightful ruler who had honored their gods. In every land he touched, memory reshaped him into something their own, so that he belonged not to one people, but to all. And yet, for all the myths and legends, the man himself remains. A youth from Macedonia, shaped by a mother's ambition and a father's legacy, taught by Aristotle, driven by visions of Achilles and Heracles. A commander who led from the front, who shared hardship with his men, who showed both mercy and savagery. A king who sought to merge worlds, who dreamed of uniting peoples under one crown, but who could also be consumed by suspicion, wrath, and grief. His story is not simple, nor his legacy unblemished. He was both hero and tyrant, visionary and destroyer. What makes Alexander endure is not only the scale of his conquests, but the audacity with which he pursued them. In an age when most rulers sought to guard their borders, he sought to erase them. In a time when the world seemed vast and unknowable, he carried his army to its edges, forcing men to look beyond what they thought possible. His achievements were astonishing, but perhaps more enduring was the sense of possibility he left behind, that the world was larger, richer, more interconnected than anyone had dared to imagine. Centuries later, when explorers set sail into oceans unknown, when empires rose across continents, when thinkers dreamed of universal brotherhood, echoes of Alexander's vision could be heard. He was not the first to dream of greatness, nor the last, but he was among the few who reshaped the world so completely that even in failure, even in fragmentation, his shadow remained. If we measure greatness, not by kindness, not by morality, but by impact, by the power to change the course of history, then Alexander stands at the summit. At 32, he had conquered more of the known world than any before him, leaving behind an age transformed. His name has endured for over 2,000 years, spoken in admiration and fear, in poetry and politics, in history and legend. He is remembered as the greatest conqueror in history, not because his empire lasted, but because his vision outlasted it. In the end, Alexander's life was a flame that burned too bright, too quickly. It consumed him and left the world forever changed in its glow. He marched from the mountains of Macedonia to the rivers of India, from the deserts of Egypt to the palaces of Persia, driven always by the dream of something greater. And though he died young, his story lives on, immortal, carried not only in books and monuments, but in the very shape of the world he left behind. This is why, even now, across millennia, we still speak his name. Alexander. The boy who became king, the man who became legend, the conqueror who became immortal.